Night School.
Night School.
So today we're going to be talking about Dr. Jordan Bernt Peterson's book, Beyond Order.
Mostly goes by Bernt.
He's mostly, Bernie. He's Bernie
mostly,
Peterson. Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. This book is a sequel to 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. We also talked about that book on the podcast with our friend Mitch. And this book is... The first book was about, largely, the rules in that were about how you need order and structure in your life in order to be successful and be mentally healthy and feel good about where your life's going. And this follow-up book is 12 more rules that sort of lean more in the direction of if you have that order in your life, you need to make sure to not risk getting too structured, too rigid, and becoming stagnant in some way. And so this book kind of counters the other book in a way, because a big part of Jordan Peterson's philosophy is the idea that chaos and order are really fundamental aspects of life.
Yeah.
And that you need to be riding this healthy line between those two to where you are not losing your mind, not directionless, but also not staying still, like growing at a rate that challenges you without overwhelming you or boring you.
Yeah.
And so this book is another way I've heard it put by Jordan Peterson is that in some ways the first book was kind of about the need for conservatism and being careful.
Right.
And that this book is more about the need for liberalism and being open and adventurous in some ways.
Yeah.
And it's very good. I love Jordan B. Peterson. We talk about him all the time.
He generally gets mentioned every episode.
Most episodes he gets a shout out in some way. I loved the first book, and I loved this one too. And thank you to my girlfriend Sarah, who bought me this book and who's also here. Yell hi, Sarah.
Hi.
And
then do the other thing, do the burp.
Do the burp again. But yeah, great book, and let's get into it. I just want to share the 12 rules with you and just some of the highlights from each of them and why they seem to be important. Great. And there's a couple of snippets from the book that I'm going to share as well that I thought were particularly interesting. The first rule, why don't I just read off the 12 rules first? Rule 1, do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. Rule 2, imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. Rule 3, do not hide unwanted things in the fog. 4, notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. Rule 5, do not do what you hate. Rule 6, abandon ideology. 7, work as hard as you possibly can on at least one thing and see what happens. 8, try to make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. 9, if old memories still upset you, write them down carefully and completely. 10, plan and work diligently to maintain the romance in your relationship. 11, do not allow yourself to become resentful, deceitful, or arrogant. And 12, be grateful in spite of your suffering. So, rule 1, do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. So in this chapter, a lot of what Jordan was talking about was some of his clinical cases, because he is a working psychologist and sees patients. Or is that the word for it?
Patients or clients.
Okay, yeah.
Either one.
And about how he ends up seeing people who are socially inept and having mental health issues and just are getting most of their social interaction from their meetings with him and just not really getting out there and hanging out with people. Something's happened that's caused them to just get kind of too inward focused and not getting out there enough. And how by like pushing people to start interacting with others, it ends up helping them in more ways than they might expect. And largely what he feels is the importance of social institutions is that social interaction is needed in order to be sane.
Right.
That being sane is not something that you can do entirely on your own, because if it's just you can get on one line of thinking and just get too hyper-focused on this one thing. If you're not bouncing your ideas off of other people, you can end up very quickly veering off into insanity because nobody's checking you.
Right.
And even if you become sane at some point, you can end up losing that if you are not constantly checking in with people.
Yeah.
He also talks a lot about games in this, and he's talked about that in a lot of places before. A lot of the things in this book are Petersonisms that I've heard so many times in different lectures and podcasts that he's done.
Yeah.
And some of it even feels very similar to some of the ideas in the first book, because it's all very similar conceptually. But something you may have heard talked about in other places from Jordan is the idea that games are so important because they're a microcosm of the world, and it's about learning to interact positively with people and work on a team with others to try and achieve a goal, and about how the higher goal than that is to play the game in such a way that other people will want to keep playing games with you. Because you can play a game and win it, but just be such a jerk about it that nobody wants to play with you anymore.
Yeah, he said before, like, you can win a small game in a way that makes you lose a way more important game. Like the game of building friendships so that you always have circles around you to keep you in check, and that you can notice how you project on and how you reflect them, like how social circles keep you sane. It's like if you play a small game in a way that breaks your social circles, you just won a tiny game in order to lose a huge game.
Right. Yeah, because now you lost your friends, and so...
Yeah, congrats.
Yeah.
When Peterson's first book maps a meaning, it seems like he mined mythology for the most essential, fundamental, useful, true ideas, and then he built all of his future work off of his researches into symbology and mythology and just really fundamental ideas from history. Mm-hmm. Like Jung had the Red Book, where he fully explored his psyche, and all of the other work that he did was based on his explorations of his psyche. Similarly, Peterson, like, researched the history of mythology, looking for the most old basic ideas, and then built his whole thing off of it. So now it seems like, it's like when you read his work, it's so like, yeah, even if I haven't heard him say this before, I've heard him express this idea in another example before.
For sure.
His thought system is really coherent.
For sure, yeah. And he often gets criticized. One of the biggest criticism that I hear about him is that he's actually unoriginal, and like none of this is his idea, which he never said any of it was. It's all based on old ideas, and he says that over and over again, that like these ideas have held up over time because they're important and we feel them in some sort of true way in the collective consciousness.
Yeah.
Or something like that. He also talks... Jordan Peterson loves Harry Potter, and it comes up quite a few times in this book. And in this chapter, he talks about the importance of understanding and learning the rules with other people, and how understanding those rules allows you to be in a comfortable position to break those rules when it's necessary.
Yeah.
You need to have a good grip on the rules of how the world works before you go breaking them. And he talks about Harry Potter in how many times throughout the story, Harry and Ron and Hermione end up breaking the rules. They sometimes follow the rules, but they sometimes break the rules, but it's always for some reason that is ultimately good and in service to the rules in some way.
Yeah.
And how that behavior often gets rewarded by the teachers who made the rules, because they understand that, like, there is something more important than just the rules.
Right.
And that's one of many times he goes off about Harry Potter and just how deeply significant it is.
Yeah.
Also, no, I'll leave that out. But he loves Harry Potter.
I wanted to comment. You mentioned that, so this is the first rule: do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievements. And after you read the rule, you mentioned that he has seen a lot of people who are in isolation, and because sanity is an outsourced problem. If you're in isolation and you become insane, I was wondering, were you connecting like people justify and perpetuate their isolation by criticizing social institutions instead of just participating in them?
He brings up those examples to show that these people were not fully understanding how valuable it would be to be in these social groups. Instead, they were thinking that like maybe they would be in a social group if they were more mentally well, or that people wouldn't like them or something like that. When the thing is, you need to jump into the world in order to become well. You have to be a part of the world and interacting with people to want to be there and to be confident enough to be there. You have to go out there and be foolish before you can be good at it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And people, what I was wondering was like, was he saying that people isolate themselves because they carelessly denigrate social institutions? You know what I mean?
Or at least that they, at the very least, that they don't appreciate it the way they should.
Yeah.
They don't understand that it's valuable. And a lot of those people also, if you get isolated for too long, you become resentful of others.
Yeah.
And you feel like other people don't care enough about you or are...
When really they just don't know about you.
Yeah.
Because you're hiding.
Yeah. The other thing he talked about is the importance of, in this chapter, is the importance of identification of things, and that we need to get on the same page about identifying what things are. And he talks a lot about his granddaughter and her like learning to point at things. He talks about his granddaughter a lot throughout the book. And I think it's important in that he kind of talks about how like being around a baby and a toddler as they're growing up ends up grounding you and making you reminds you of certain things that are important that you might have forgotten.
Yeah.
And I'll have more to say about that later in other chapters. But he talks about his granddaughter learning to point at things because she wants to like know what you call that thing, and how it's very important that we all get on the same page about what words mean and about what things are. Otherwise, just nothing makes sense anymore because we have to come up with some way to identify things.
Right.
Yeah.
I remember in this, I forgot that I had read this book. Apparently I did, or at least part of it, how she called anything soft that she could pet puppy because puppy means soft thing I can pet.
I don't think that's in this. No.
Yeah.
Is it?
Well, I don't know if it was puppy, doggy, or something like that. Because it was a puppy. She saw a cat and she called the cat puppy. And Jordan said she was right. It is a puppy because puppy means soft thing that I can pet. So that's a puppy because that's what that word means to her. Like to empathize with like how she did categorization.
You know, it took me a month to read it, so maybe I forgot that. But
It's a huge book.
I don't think that was in there.
Okay.
That might have just been from elsewhere. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Rule 2, imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. In this chapter, he talked a lot about stories and why certain stories end up being told over and over again and sort of shifted into slightly different versions to make them kind of fresh, even though it is the same heroic journey usually and the same like archetypes that are doing the same sorts of things within the story, and about how those stories end up being so important to us because we do see that there is this immense potential in us to be like an avatar of the perfect person, of the person that can save the world or whatever, that we have this immense potential in us and we see that. And when we see these stories, we can feel inspired and we want to emulate these characters in them. And so a lot of stories are unoriginal and they're repetitions of these ancient stories. Like I've heard many different things. I've never read Beowulf, but like many things are basically an adaptation of Beowulf for some sort of modern audience. And just these stories get told over and over again and shifted in different cultural contexts because they're important and because we idolize these heroic characters and we're inspired by them.
Yeah.
And so, he definitely talked about Harry Potter a lot in there too, because there's all kinds of interesting archetypal symbolism in the book that really sticks with people, and it certainly has. It's hugely popular. It still is, yeah. Even though the author's canceled, nothing's really changed. Everybody still loves it, even though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This was the third rule?
That's the second rule.
Okay, what is it again?
Imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that.
Cool.
So these characters inspire us and we aim to be more like them.
Yeah.
And he also talked about, in this chapter, about how we need to understand the darkness of what we could potentially be, the dark things that we could potentially do, and how you need to understand how bad you could be to understand how good you could be. Mm-hmm. That the deeper you reach, the deeper your roots go, the higher your branches can go, sort of thing. And I like that idea, and it feels very true. And I think it concerns me when people act as though something is beyond them or it's unimaginable that somebody could do something like whatever. Because, like, you could.
Yeah.
Just if the situation went the way it should or the way it could, you could end up doing something bad.
Right. Like Shane Gillis said, being racist is like being hungry. It's like, well, I'm not racist right now.
I guess it's like that. Yeah. Love Shane Gillis.
He said, it's not like you have it or you don't have it.
It's true. Yeah. Temporary condition. Rule 3 is do not hide unwanted things in the fog. And there is a little excerpt I want to read here. This is about, well, this chapter in general is about how it's important to not be hiding things from yourself or from others that you feel to be true, and to be careful to not just end up looking away from things in your life. That's the way when I talk about something like this, I talk about looking away from things. Like, there can be things that you feel in your heart that you're kind of looking away from. And also he's talking about hiding things from others as well. Mm-hmm. And that it can be, the way he put it is that you hide things in the fog because you kind of don't want to know. You don't want to look at them directly. And sometimes that's because you may be scared that if you know it, if you look directly at that and you know what it is that you're thinking or what it is that you want, that can be scary because then you might fail. Because then if you know it, then you might fail to get it. Or it might be scary to succeed. It might be scary because then you have to face that you want to do this, and maybe that thing is going to be really hard to do.
Yeah.
And so it can be scary in either direction. This is the excerpt I wanted to read here. A certain necessary humility must accompany such raw revelations. I should not say, at least not ideally, you have been ignoring me lately. I should say instead, I feel isolated and lonely and hurt, and I cannot help but feel that you have not been as attentive to me over the last few months as I would have liked, or that might have been best for us as a couple. But I am unsure if I am imagining all this because I am upset, or if I am genuinely seeing what is going on. The latter statement gets the point across, but avoids the accusatory stance that so often serves as the first defense against a serious get-to-the-bottom-of-things conversation. And it is very possible that you are wrong about just what is causing you to feel the way you do. If you are, you need to know it, because there is no point in propagating errors that are causing you and others pain and interfering with your future. Best to find out what is true, best to disperse the fog, and find out if the sharp objects you feared were lurking there are real or fantastical. And there is always the danger that some of them are real, but it is better to see them than to keep them occluded by the fog, because you can at least sometimes avoid the danger that you are willing to see. And so for context, he's talking here about the idea that if you do hide things in the fog, they can end up coming out in a way that is sloppy, and that if you are deliberate about exposing these things and careful about how you discuss them, things can go much better, because things that are hidden often end up coming out in some way.
Right.
And if you're not careful about it, then they'll come out in a sloppy way.
Yeah.
Yeah. He also tells a story about his in-laws, his wife's mom and dad, and about how they had this problem where one day his father-in-law got angry at his mother-in-law because he would come home on lunch, I guess, as is tradition in this area that they live in, Canada. He would come home for lunch. They would have a 2-hour lunch period, and his wife would make him lunch, but she would make it on these smaller plates. They have two sizes of plates, and she would make it on the small ones. And after like 30 years of doing this, he was like, why do you keep putting them on these plates? The plates that she had been putting them on forever. And that would have been something that had been bothering him forever, that she was making him lunch on these tiny plates for no reason when you could use the big plates. But he just didn't feel like it was worth going into. It was just not worth discussing. And he points out that like something like that, although, it isn't a big deal, it also isn't a big deal to fix it. And that while it is just this minor annoyance, it's a minor annoyance that you spend 20 seconds being annoyed about every day for 30 years. And if
that
you
adds
start,
up a lot.
If you start doing the math on that, like it's a massive chunk of your life. And even if there is some daily thing or some weekly thing or even some monthly thing that is a nuisance, it can be really tempting to just be like, it's not worth it. But if it's annoying you and if it's recurring, it is best to get it out there and to discuss it and to not hide it in the fog forever until it comes out that you've been angry about this a little bit every day for 30 years.
Yeah.
And it's a really good story to support that. Yeah.
That's got to be super common.
For sure. Yeah. Rule 4. Notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. He talks in this chapter about how people are actually happiest and feel best about how their life is going when they're in the middle of doing something hard. And when people look back on any hard thing that they did, they usually feel good about the fact that they did it. They usually feel that it was something worth doing. And although we tend to lean towards comfort, we actually end up feeling the most fulfillment if we're doing something difficult that's challenging us a lot.
Yeah.
And he talks about the idea that it is important to view your future self as someone that you are committed to and to be doing things for the sake of your future self and to view that as like a committed relationship as though it was your spouse, to view your future self as somebody who deserves your time and attention now, and they'll appreciate it later. Yeah. And he also talks in that about just how quickly you can end up improving your work situation if you start doing things that make you indispensable there and that other people are not paying attention to. And I feel a little bit cynical about that in some cases because I think a lot of employers don't care, but it is certainly, it would at least make you feel good. And if it isn't appreciated, it would make you know that this isn't the right place to be if it doesn't end up rewarding you. But maybe I'm too cynical about that, and you actually typically would be rewarded for picking up slack that nobody else is doing.
I remember Peterson talking about doing what is good for every version of yourself across space-time. It was like a kind of mystical extrapolation, or like he was expanding in a kind of a mystical way on this principle in a lecture. And he was saying that if you do something that is pleasant for 10 minutes, but is going to cause you unpleasantness for 2 weeks, then you're serving a very small slice of what you are in space-time. But if you do something that is good for every part of you in the past and the future, and all of the various motivations in you, then you're acting in service to everything that you are. And I have this kind of reaction to some of the principles in this book that they're kind of they sound kind of grounded in this idea that like effort is necessary to make life meaningful. Like he seems to believe that the ground of existence is chaos and that it's only our intervention as beings that can turn that into order. Like,
I think that's what he thinks.
Yeah, that seems to be what he thinks, right? And I think there's another perspective that the ground of reality is order, and all we have to do is not fuck it up. That what we're really doing is distorting and creating illusion in an underlying bed of perfect order, and that effortlessness is enlightenment. Whereas for Jordan Peterson, it's more like effortful striving in the direction of enlightenment is the answer. So there's two different ways of thinking about that. But what was interesting is that and his thing on time, it was making me think about that too, because I've been having these reactions in my head to every principle that you've said before. It's like all of this is based on separation. Like all of this is based on like human stories being what's fundamental and effort being what makes things meaningful, instead of like the effortless presence of God being what makes things meaningful. But in this one, it's almost like his concept of how you act and how it serves the versions of you in time. It's almost satisfying to both of those fundamental ideas, because like if you just act with like effortful or like joyful diligence is like a Buddhist principle, like just behave with joyful diligence in each moment, which is compatible with what Peterson is saying there. It's like be excellent, be indispensable, because even if your job doesn't treat you as indispensable and reward you for your effort, you're still building the habit of being a joyfully diligent person, which means that your next job, you're going to be more competent. Probably at home, you're going to be more competent. You're just not building the habit of being like a half-hearted, lazy person or something.
Yeah.
But what do you think about his underlying assumption that like human effort has to, he almost thinks that we're propping up reality as a result of our will, as opposed to, surrendering.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I think what you're saying reminds me a lot of the Enuma Elish origin story to the world, which he talks about in this book, the story of Tiamat and Marduk.
Right.
The idea that Tiamat is this chaotic monster that ruled the world, like a goddess of the ocean or something like that. And Marduk is like this great god that comes in and ends up creating order out of the chaos that is Tiamat.
Yeah.
And Jordan did say at some point in this book the idea that we are that which is here to order the world and to create order out of chaos. But he did then go on to say after that we are also here to shake up and revivify the world if it's become stagnant, and to create a sort of chaos that ends up becoming healthier as time goes on. One of the, I would have brought this up in a later rule, but one of the things he talked about is like how artists will end up going, and artists would sort of lean in a liberal direction, lean in a chaotic direction, will be the types of people that will go into an area that is old, but they think that they see some kind of potential in it, and they start a sort of artistic movement in some old city or some old borough of New York or whatever that they see something in that has not been appreciated now, and they'll start an art exhibit, and they'll start having more and more art in the area, which eventually leads to gentrification and a sense of order that comes out of that. And then they become no longer necessary there. And the artist force needs to then move on to some other area that needs to be revivified, which will happen for a while. And there's a cool golden era in that area, which then eventually gets gentrified. And then they then have to move on. And so he views like humans as potentially a chaotic force that's meant to revivify that which has become stagnant in areas.
Right.
And so I think that he kind of sees it both ways. And I think that also your reaction to this makes some sense, in that this book is more about being chaotic and about doing things. And I bet that if I was reading through the rules from the first book, you would feel differently about it. Like you wouldn't be having the same knee-jerk reaction to each rule I'm reading if it was the rules from the first book, because they would be more about, well, no, I guess because your thing is about ordering. Like he views us as like that which orders the chaos.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The thing that I question about his underlying premise, and I feel like an asshole questioning the underlying premise of the author you're presenting while you're presenting it. It's like, wait, just listen, right? That's okay. But it's like, he's saying that we should just say whatever's on our mind. So I'm like, well, that gives me a pass. Uh-huh. Yeah. He seems to start with the premise that the universe is made of chaos, fundamentally. That if he takes the Tiamat story as his Genesis story, and he says that, that like in the beginning there was chaos. And that was probably how he would interpret the first line of the Bible. In the beginning there was chaos, but then free will emerged to make order out of the chaos, so that it could strike a perfect balance between chaos and order, and that's the goal somehow. Mm-hmm. But if if it seems like such a weird premise to me, because if he believes that everything was built on the ground of the transcendent, why would the transcendent not be perfect, loving peace? And why would that not be where everything began? Isn't it a strange premise? Like, the perfect, loving peace of transcendence is the ground of reality, and that's the only thing anything can emerge from. So we came from total chaos, and we need to fix it. It's like, wait, what? Isn't that strange?
Yeah, I don't know if he actually takes the Tiamat story, if not, I don't mean literally, but like if he has that in his heart as like what he views the world to ultimately be. I think maybe he's using it more as just an example of what we should be doing in the world, but I don't know if he would believe that the underlying fabric of the world is a chaos that only we can order. I don't know.
Like, if it's strange to hear this presentation, because I've been contemplating Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle all day, and they're built on totally different premises. Like, they're opposite books, which is interesting because we both like both of them.
Yeah.
But Eckhart Tolle is saying everything is absolutely perfect. If you surrender your will and your intention and your presence to what is fundamental, everything's perfect. We don't need to solve problems. We need to stop generating problems.
Bless you.
And Peterson is saying the world is made of problems, and we need to go around solving them. It's completely opposite premises. It's really interesting.
Yeah. And I do, in some way, kind of hold both to be true. And I guess the way I'm looking at that is that I think what Eckhart Tolle is saying is true on a higher level. That, like, what Jordan Peterson is saying, the premise of his rules and everything are the right way to function in our society. And Eckhart Tolle is almost saying, like, here's how you transcend society. Like, here's how you think in a way to where society barely affects you. And
So if you had to estimate, who do you think is having a more positive effect on society between the two?
I think Jordan Peterson could get through to more people because he makes, and Eckhart Tolle makes sense to me, but Jordan Peterson makes more sense than Eckhart does to most people. Most people would read Eckhart Tolle and be like, this is, what the hell is,
Yeah,
like, it would sound like gibberish to them.
Yeah, just complete gibberish, yeah.
This would make sense to anybody. Anybody could read through this and get what he's talking about.
Yeah.
There's some places where it goes a little mystical, but not nearly to where Eckhart would go.
Yeah.
And I would say that Jordan Peterson is more popular probably, and that this is a more practical way for most people to improve their lives compared to the Power of Now. But I kind of think that the Power of Now is bigger than this and is like a higher level than this. And maybe this is on the way to that. Maybe that would be the way it would typically go for people.
Right. Because maybe if your life is complete chaos, you can't even, like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like maybe you need to just get the basics straight before you can even think about discovering the self or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that it makes a lot of sense to read Jordan's first 12 Rules book first, because that is, I think, what more people need is more order in their life. I think a lot more people are sort of directionless than just sort of stagnant in their life. Well, I don't know if that's true. I don't know. But it feels to me like it makes more sense to read that other book first, and that this would come after that, and that typically people would be able to understand the Power of Now better after this.
Yeah.
Which they're so separate, but that's how I view it.
Cool.
Yeah.
I hope you don't mind the segue.
Not at all.
For
No,
me, it was
I
an
love
elephant
Power
in the
Now.
room. So it was, I think, I felt better addressing it than
Sure.
just like listening to the principles.
That's great. Yeah. Rule 6, Rule 5, and probably my favorite one, do not do what you hate. Mm-hmm. If there's anything you don't like, if you're being asked to participate in something that you hold deeply to be wrong or untrue, just don't do it, because you see yourself do it and it brings you down. And this could be things like peer pressure to do something illegal or that you feel is just not right for whatever reason. Don't do it. The big example that he talks about in here is sort of modern ideological ideas. And he gives an example of a woman that a client that he was working with, who was working in an office where there was sort of postmodern ideas about critical race theory being pushed, and she felt really against it, and like what was happening was not true and didn't actually make sense and was a negative effect on the world, and how he helped her get to a point where she was comfortable saying that she didn't want to participate in those things. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important. And I think that it really brings you down when you see yourself doing things that you're not happy about. And when you, like, there's been plenty of times in my life where I've been critical of something, and still there's things that I'm critical of in the world that I end up doing anyway. And I don't feel good about that when I do that. And it feels really good when you go against what the world is doing because you think that it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And it feels
makes a lot of sense for that to be a beyond order rule, because a lot of chaos can break out when you refuse to do things that you hate.
Yeah.
That can get you in some serious doo-doo.
Yeah. Yeah. You can be ostracized from social groups and stuff, but it's important to do that anyway.
Yeah. And
yeah, if you feel something is true and it's really unpopular, you should say it. He would suggest that you say what you believe to be true and deal with the consequences of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Rule 6, abandon ideology. This is really broad, and a lot of the ideas are also sort of like, a lot of the ideologies that he's talking about are sort of postmodern things, but what he's saying is that you should never start thinking that any one thing in the world is the reason that there's problems in the world, and believe that you can prescribe, you can diagnose the problem with the world. It's just this thing. And if we could fix this thing, this would be all better. I tend to think that way about technology sometimes, that like technology is the problem, and that if like technology wasn't where it was, that like things would be so much better. That's like the one that I tend to fall into. But there's a lot of ideologies, and there's a little quote I want to read here about that. Beware of intellectuals who make a monotheism out of their theories of motivation. Beware, in more technical terms, of blanket univariate, single variable, causes for diverse, complex problems. Of course, power plays a role in history, as does economics, but the same can be said of jealousy, love, hunger, sex, cooperation, revelation, anger, disgust, sadness, anxiety, religion, compassion, disease, technology, hatred, and chance, none of which can definitively be reduced to another. The attraction of doing so is, however, obvious simplicity, ease, and the illusion of mastery, which can have exceptionally useful psychological and social consequences, particularly in the short term. And let us not forget the frequent discovery of a villain or set of villains upon which the hidden motivations for the ideology can be vented. And I think we see this happening all the time in different directions. But a lot of people feel very confident that they know what the problem in the world is, and that it's this one thing. And it never is. And if you think you know what the problem is, you don't, because it's more complicated than you could imagine. Yeah. He talks also about Nietzsche quite a bit in this chapter, and about the idea that he said God is dead, and about how that is often understood incompletely, as though that was Nietzsche celebrating that God is dead.
Right.
He was not celebrating it. He's saying God is dead. Now we have to find another God, and that's not good.
Yeah.
Because there's not going to be some one thing that's going to be perfect.
Right.
And about how people are trying to fill that hole with some other ideology, and it's always going to be incomplete and lacking.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is sort of the clean your room idea, but you really shouldn't be trying to diagnose the world and what's wrong with the world if you don't have your own life in order. That you need to focus first on fixing fix a problem in your life, and then fix another bigger problem in your life, and focus on bigger and bigger problems in your life until you don't have any. And then maybe you can help other people, and maybe you can help your community, and look at bigger and bigger problems. But you have to start from a base of fixing the things in your own life before you start trying to point your finger at some particular aspect of the world, because it's not the order that it's supposed to go in. You gotta get your room straight before you go trying to clean the whole world.
Right.
Yeah.
I hate myself for how completely I'm disagreeing with every single thing that he's saying.
Really?
Yeah.
What do you disagree with about that?
It's so painful, because I was like, I don't want to be an asshole and just like it's a Jordan Peterson debate, right? But I'm like, but I also don't want to be inauthentic and just listen if I'm just like, what the hell is he talking about?
Really?
Yeah.
Well, what about that? Do you have a problem with?
Like the last one, for example, like most people who are possessed by ideologies because it allows them to belong to a group. So they kind of adopt they adopt a set of ideologies as a package. So this is the right religion, and then these ideas come along with that, and then the societal implications of this. So we have these cultural norms, and it's all this kind of coherent package. But it sounds like what Peterson has done is build his own ideology from scratch, so that it seems like all he's doing is thinking truthfully and realistically, when really he's looking at everything through an ideological lens. But it's like this kind of new hodgepodge ideological lens that he's built himself in a basement, and then taken out and gone, I'm going to see everything through this lens, but everybody should abandon ideology. So it's like the only way to abandon ideology is like enlightenment, right? Like to be so grounded in eternal and ultimate reality that you can see everything as separate objects interacting in an illusory way, and you're not caught up in judgments, for example, like I'm judging this as right or wrong. There's not really a right or wrong, because it's all one stuff. There's this kind of like non-judgmental way of being outside of ideology and opinion, and just being grounded in what's permanent and just living that out. And that's kind of what I assume when I hear abandoned ideology, but that he's going like, but like his entire worldview is like based on these interpretations of ancient mythologies, and then like modern biological evidence of those ancient mythologies, truths that they express, how it's reflected in modern science now. It's like a very advanced system that he's created, but it's an ideology. And in the ideology that he's created, there's bad guys. And so he's always against, like, he's like, this is wrong. This is not beautiful. This is bad. These people are, there's always bad guys in Jordan Peterson's story. Always. He's obsessed with bad guys. Like it's always the neo-Marxists or, these people or those people, mostly neo-Marxists, I guess. So on that one, I was like, no, you're ideologically possessed. You just made your own. So it seems less like it. But you've only gone beyond ideology if you've gone beyond judgment, and you don't see right or wrong anymore. Like you just see the whole thing's kind of balancing itself out, and all I have to do is just stop messing it up and just let it balance itself out. But he goes out like trying to be the hero and prove some people wrong and prove other people right. And he has all these strong opinions and judgments. And so that one, it was hard to sit through, because I'm like, no, he has tons of ideologies. And then the next one, he was talking about, what was the last one that you
Don't do what you hate?
Yeah, and then what's the one after that?
Abandoned ideology. That's
after that.
We haven't said that one yet.
Oh, what were we talking about when I was like, oh, it's so painful how hard I disagree right now?
Maybe it was about there's no one thing that's the problem. About Nietzsche, God is dead.
Yeah, the one thing he's saying, if you think that there's one problem and you know what the one problem is, then you're wrong, and you are possessed by ideology, basically. But he has this really strong. He's like a clinical philosopher, right? Like he's looked at society and like diagnosed it, and he's trying to treat society based on his diagnosis. And so the diagnosis that he's given of society is the single problem that he's basing his rights and wrongs and heroes and villains around. And in that story, he's trying to play the hero. So he's trying to go out, prove right and prove wrong.
Yeah.
It's not So he's made this diagnosis and said, okay, I know what the problem with society is. So now I'm going to go about and try to fix it. Oh no, this was the thing, is he's saying you shouldn't go out and try to fix the world if you have problems in your life. So you should fix the problems in your life until your life is in order. Then you can go out and criticize the world. But he goes out constantly criticizing the world, right? So he's basically saying, I don't have problems in my life and I'm fit to criticize the world, setting up other people to try to perfect themselves so that they can then criticize the world, when it's not really possible to perfect your life and not have any problems in your life, unless we're talking about like final realization type of shit, unless we're talking about like Christ, like sainthood or something. At which point you wouldn't criticize the world because they can't judge. So it's like, it's just this weird way of thinking that he's like, once you have no problems, he's setting up people to try to set up their lives with no problems. Like, yeah, so that they can criticize the world. It's insane, right? To tell people, solve all of the problems in your life before you criticize the world. And by the way, I, Dr. Jordan Peterson, criticize the world all the time and have like elected myself to kind of diagnose it and treat it. Like I'm the nation's clinician. But he has plenty of problems. So how can he stand on that?
Yeah, and I think it's, I think when he says ideology, he's talking about people that are possessed by the idea that one thing is the problem with the world, and that if one thing was changed, the world would be good, that they become focused on one problem or one cause of problems in the world. And I think that it's not fair to say that he is also possessed by an ideology, because I think he does think very complexly about the different stances that people are coming from and about how there are a lot of factors. Like, I don't think he falls into this thing where he just thinks there's a univariable reason for the world not being perfect as it is.
Right. You know how we've talked about how the term, the concept slut is so stupid because everybody who wants to draw somebody as a slut, the definition is whoever is sluttier than me. So it's like a made up word that just means anybody who has a different, who has set a different sexual boundary than me, I can just call them bad.
Or the person I'm talking to about this currently.
Yeah, me and the person I'm talking to right now, who I want on my side.
Yeah.
Whoever is more X or Y than us, then they count as that.
Yes.
He may have created a definition of ideology intentionally to exclude his own ideological possession. So an ideology is a set of beliefs that people ascribe to in order to belong to a certain community group, even if it contradicts other community groups and places them at odds with others. He could kind of treat ideology like it's that, but he's operating on this ideology that the one problem with the world is that chaos and order are not properly balanced, yet the original reality is made of chaos, and it's on sentient beings to generate order and then balance chaos and order successfully. And the reason there's problems in the world is because we have not yet succeeded in that absolutely absurd goal. Like, absolutely absurd. Like, we started from chaos. We have to create order and then balance chaos and order correctly. Since it's not happening yet, we haven't done it. So I need to go out and teach everybody how to balance chaos and order successfully. And if they'll all just listen to me and balance chaos and order successfully, then there will be no more problems. And that's the insane ideological basis of his whole book. Right?
I get what you're saying. And I think if you used different words other than ideology, like, he's just saying that people oversimplify the problems with the world because they want it to be simple, because that makes them feel more comfortable. And I don't think that he ever oversimplifies the current state of the world. And I don't think that he views there to be like an end goal. And maybe it wasn't fair of me to represent that, like, you need to have no problems in your life, because of course that's not a real thing. And he even sort of mocks himself a little bit in this book about the fact that he says there's a meme going around on the internet where people are making fun of him because his room is dirty behind him there's like a podcast that he was doing, and his office behind him was a huge mess. He had a bunch of unopened letters and stuff, a bunch of work that he was in the middle of. And he was like, and they do have a point. Like, yeah, I have let some things slip, and I really should be spending more time focusing on that. So he does acknowledge that, like, that's not actually something he does perfectly in his life. And I get what you're saying about, in a way, that sort of chaos and order balance being an ideology. But I think that's so big and so complex that it kind of is really separate from saying something like, the problem in the world is that technology is making us crazy. Like that, it's so much more complicated than that, because it contains that and contains so many other things. And I don't think he views there as being an end goal. And I don't think that the point of this is that, like, the world is currently bad, but it was good in the past and we can make it good again in the future if we just follow my rules here. I think he's just saying that you need to build up to, you need to not bite off more than you can chew. And we should be trying to either order things that are too chaotic or mix things up that have gone stagnant and are not moving in a healthy way, wherever those two things are the case. And you should start on the smallest level. You should start in your own life. And when you feel comfortable with that, you should be taking on bigger challenges. And I don't think there's any expectation that your life will ever be perfect, because that's not real. But he's just viewing that as like stepping stones. They're higher levels. It's a level system, and you should start small before you start trying to go big. And I don't view that as ideology in the way that he's using the word, because that chaos and order thing is so multivariant. There's so many different things that go into that. And depending on what culture you live in and like where you live, there's going to be so many different ways that would manifest. Whereas if you're saying technology's no good, it's much simpler and much more concrete and too confident and like just too simplified to actually be effective.
Right.
Making sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not going to agree with the principles that he's saying, because I disagree with his like underlying premise, but at least I can engage in it authentically by being like, this is why that doesn't make sense to me.
For sure. Yeah. And you should say what you want to say.
Cool.
Yeah.
Dope.
The next rule is work as hard as you possibly can on at least one thing and see what happens. And this chapter is a lot about the idea that so many people have Peter Pan syndrome, where it's like they have a hard time picking anything to actually do and anything to actually focus on, and about how the worst decision you can make is to make no decision. And that hits me a little bit. Like I have a hard time picking a lane and focusing on something, but his point is that you need to become something or else you'll become nothing.
Yeah.
And if you don't pick, then you'll just be a man or woman child forever. And that's a really bad thing to be.
I was going to ask how that's reflected in the Peter Pan story. So that he declines the adventure. Like a real girl offers him an adventure and he declines, and so he stays a boy.
Yeah, the idea is that Peter Pan meaning everything in Latin or something like that, is a man who's decided not to grow up, and he's just moved to Neverland, and he just behaves like a child and hangs out with kids forever.
I never thought of that with Neverland either. Neverland as in like never land on anything, like.
Yeah, I guess I imagine it like never grow up land. Like I'm never gonna leave here.
Like no land.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna do what I want, and he lives with a bunch of little kids that hang out with him, and he talks a lot about that story and about how he declines to grow up and make a decision and actually be out in the real world. I don't remember the thing with Wendy. He declines to leave with Wendy or something like that. Or does
I
Wendy...
only remember it from hearing him talk about it. I don't remember ever even seeing the movie. Yeah, there was a little fairy, Tinkerbell, right?
Yeah.
And he could have gone somewhere with Wendy, but he declined, and then he went with Tinkerbell instead. And so Peterson was saying that Wendy represented like a sincere, normal human thing, and Tinkerbell represented like a stupid fantasy. Like he compared Wendy to having a wife and Tinkerbell to pornography.
Right. This just ever evolving fairy.
Yeah.
Yeah. He talks about porn with that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But you got to pick something. You got to grow up, and you got to become something or become nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Try to make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. This is one where he talked a lot about his granddaughter and about going for walks and like watching the world through a kid's eyes, and how much that is different from how we end up looking at the world. And he talked about this because he said when he was a kid, he knew his neighborhood so well. He knew he could explain and describe every detail of every house in the neighborhood. He knew exactly how long it took to get from one point to another point. He knew every shortcut he could take in between there. And his scope was very small, but he was so interested in everything that was going on around him.
Yeah.
And now we just see that's a house, and we don't pay attention to every aspect about the house because we decide that it's not useful information to have, and we have priorities to get to.
Yeah.
And he talked about even going for walks with his children when they were little, that he would get so antsy and fussy about wanting to know, like, how long are we going to be gone, and like getting annoyed when his kids want to like stop and look at a bug for 5 minutes or whatever. And like, he wants to keep going. And he brings that up to show that having a room be deliberately beautiful ends up drawing your attention to it, and like brings you into the present. And this one actually reminded me a lot of the principle of like be here now, or the power of now. Like being present in this moment can be a really beneficial thing for people. And he talks a lot about the importance of beauty and the importance of art in the world. And that's not something that I appreciate enough. I end up being very like functional about things.
Yeah.
I guess it's just kind of the way my brain works. But he thinks that you should pick a room, if not your whole house, pick at least one room and try to make that look really beautiful so that when you're there, you're like interested in looking at it.
Yeah.
He said that you should go out and you should buy art, like go buy a painting that makes you feel good, that like resonates with you in some way personally. Yeah. Buy it and take it home and put it on the wall, and then every time you'll remember, like, I like this. I like this. And it brings you into that moment.
Nice.
Yeah. And this is also where he talked about that idea that art revives cities, and like artists in the area make you appreciate the city and see the city in a way that you typically wouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. If old memories still upset you, this is rule 9. If old memories still upset you, write them down carefully and completely. So this is, I mean, I guess it's pretty self-explanatory. The idea being that like, if you have moments where like some memory comes back to you, this happens to me all the time. Like you'll be driving and like you remember something that you said and you go like, God.
Yeah.
You just like cringe, remembering like, I cannot believe I said or did that.
And then you counterbalance the shame by absolutely demolishing somebody in an argument in your head.
Yeah. But also just like any bad thing that may have happened to you, like remembering that, it makes you like feel awful or angry or, I don't know, just hurt by what happened. And he gives an example of like, of a woman that was a client of his who was reflecting on sexual abuse that she went through as a kid, and how going through and writing that story out and going through all the details can make you look at it in a way that makes you understand it better. And that a lot of times you end up looking back on these events that happened, and the problem is you're just going like, I can't believe that person would do this.
Right.
But if you understand why that person would do this, and if you really get in that state of mind and think like, why would this person do this? Then it's not as upsetting anymore, because it's like, I get it all. So what's there to think about anymore? I get the whole thing. And with one client, he talked specifically about how, like, in reflecting on this, the woman realized that she was imagining this, like, this big person who was so much more powerful than her, sexually abusing her. But then as she tells the story, she realizes, like, wait, I was 5 and he was 6. And like, this was not, I'm remembering this as though I'm a 5-year-old, and it is a scary situation. But looking back on it now, it's like, oh, these are children that are not being watched closely enough. And and it gave her a different understanding of it. It makes her go like, oh, I'm not hurt by this because I'm talking about something a 6-year-old did. And it put it in a very different light for her.
Yeah.
And he also talked here about his self-authoring program, which is something you can do online that I have done and Sarah's done as well, where you basically go through and you write out. It gives you like a structure to sort of write about different, I think he uses the word epochs of your life, and just all the sort of key moments in that, which helps you understand your whole history and understand like how you got to where you are and who you are in a really valuable way. And I loved doing that. It's like, it's a thing where it gives you like past authoring, where you do your past, present authoring, where it gives you different sort of prompts about yourself and where you're at now. And then future authoring, where you give like, how bad could the next 5 years go and how good could the next 5 years go?
Yeah.
And that was really valuable for me. I loved doing it when I did it. And that's something you can do online, self-authoring.
I remember something related to this, him talking about exposure therapy and how he was interested in the brain circuits that you use involuntarily to think about something that frightens you being very different than the brain circuits you use to voluntarily think about something that frightens you. And that the memory changes when you think about it on purpose, because when you think about something involuntarily, you turn away from it. Like you use that phrase, like you turn away from it as it emerges in your awareness, so that you only get a glimpse of it. And then what you remember is the caricature of the awareness of the memory of you half looking away from it.
Yeah.
So it's like the memory pops up, you look away from it, and then you see a blurred image because of the looking away.
Yeah.
And then when you turn around and look at it clearly and see what it actually is, it turns out to not be nearly as bad as it looks when it's blurry because you're whipping your head away from it.
Yeah.
Because I think he was talking about like exposure therapy being for that purpose.
Yeah. Interesting. And I think there's also like, there's an idea there where I think he said this somewhere before, that basically you also see yourself looking away from it. So you see that, like, this is how I react to it, and it reinforces that reaction in the future. I know historically that I'm scared of this, so I'm scared of this, so I'm scared currently.
Right.
And if you see yourself do it, you become braver because you believe that you're braver because, I saw myself do this already. And the first time braving something is always the hardest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
He also talked here about the idea that you can become much stronger and much braver just by reading bad history, like reading old history books of like horrible things that happened. He talked about a book called, it's a book about, I think it's called Ordinary Men, and it's about men that ended up becoming Nazis and like the process that they went through to become that, and how you can become much stronger and braver just by realizing the darkness that you're capable of. And I wonder if this was maybe in another rule, because it doesn't quite fit here, but that was something that was very interesting in the book. He had a guy who was having a lot of fear about the world, and having him just sort of read really dark stories about people that have done bad things and how they got there made him much stronger and braver.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Rule 10 is plan and work diligently to maintain the romance in your relationship. So this is very...
That makes sense as a beyond order thing too.
Yeah. It's very practical and pragmatic, kind of the advice that he gives here. And a lot of what he has to say is like people can be reluctant to do actual work about their relationship and to put the right kind of effort in because they feel like, oh, it shouldn't be like that. I shouldn't have to do that. I shouldn't have to tell you this. This should just happen naturally. We shouldn't have to define how often we're going to do whatever. It should just happen. And that can be unrealistic, and that's not typically how things are going to work. Some of the specific advice he gave is to, and this is something he talks about with some of the clients where he's ended up working with married couples. It's not something he does specifically, but it often ends up happening if something is relevant to the spouse or the spouse wants to come in and talk about things.
Yeah.
He'll tell people to go on dates even if they don't want to. And even if they protest and they go like, no, it's just going to end in a fight. It's just going to suck. And we're going to hate each other even more. And it's going to be a waste of time and a waste of money. And then sometimes they would even come back and be like, it did suck. It was terrible. And we didn't have a good time. It was really annoying. And he'll just have them keep going on dates and tell them that, like, if you keep going, though, you will get better at it because you guys haven't done it very much. So maybe you just need more practice. And I bet you'll both get better at dating if you just keep doing it. And so he encourages people to basically go, like married couples in particular, he's talking about here, like go on dates, even if you both don't really want to. And typically you're going to end up having fun after a few of them, and it's going to be good for you. You got to say what you want, and that can be really scary because a lot of times in relationships, people can end up not saying what they want, what they like, or what they don't like, what they want out of the relationship or what they want sexually or all kinds of different things, because it can be very scary to say that, because if you say that, you're being vulnerable, like you're showing a sensitive part of yourself that you're scared might be rejected or laughed at or mocked in some way. And people will sort of expect that their partner should just know, like they should know, they should be able to tell, they should be able to figure it out. But that's not how people typically work. And he encourages people to just be saying everything that you actually want. And that's an act of trust. And you have to trust somebody to be able to do that. But if you don't, then you're just going to never get what you want, because there's no chance you're going to get what you want if you can't even say it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jordan also talks about the idea that within a relationship, you should strive to be in a relationship where you are actively negotiating, which is a difficult thing to do because it is much easier to slip into a situation where one person kind of becomes the tyrant that is making all the decisions, and the other person is becoming sort of a willing, subservient slave to that person, because it just becomes easier for this relationship to function if one person's will is actually getting imposed way more than the other.
Yeah.
But you need to strive to be in a situation where you're both negotiating and you're both willing to give and take and willing to bring up anything that you feel is worth bringing up.
Yeah.
All little chores need to be settled is a big thing he talks about. Any little chore that you're going to do many times over the course of your life, if you're going to be married for 50 years, you better be clear about like what chores are important to you and how often you think they should be done and whose responsibility they should be. And that sort of thing needs to be settled so that you'll have a healthy relationship forever, for the long term.
Yeah.
And he recommends that everybody needs to talk to their partner at least 90 minutes a week, which seems so low to me. That seems like a pretty small amount of time. I guess he's a busy guy. But you should be making at least an hour and a half a week to be talking to each other. And
is he saying
up.
At least once a week there should be an hour and a half of just straight, undivided talking back and forth, or just at least a total of that?
I think at least a total of that. At least a total where you're just sitting together and talking about your days and things like that.
Yeah.
Which seems low to me. But I guess maybe a lot of people just get into a groove where they just don't ever do that.
I've heard his work schedule is just nuts because
Probably,
like
yeah.
Huberman, he's like posted his schedule. Like, this is what I do in a day. It's crazy.
Does he?
14-hour work days. Yeah.
Jeez. Rule 11. Do not allow yourself to become resentful, deceitful, or arrogant. To me, this rule felt like kind of all over the place and barely like a coherent rule. He talked about, I think, 3 different Disney movies and about Harry Potter. It was just like, it really felt like just a greatest hits of Jordan Peterson talking about like the dangers of different things. It felt just kind of not clear, not
More than one
tight
rule.
enough.
That is, deceitful, arrogant, or resentful.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are massive vices.
It just felt like it feels like a mashup just
Yeah.
to make one rule out of it because he didn't want to let any of them go.
Yeah.
But one thing he talked about that I thought was interesting was about not letting yourself become deceitful, which is really the same as one of the first 12 rules, which is don't lie or tell the truth or at least don't lie.
Yeah.
And that it's very arrogant to believe that your lie will ever stand. He basically talks about how there is this fabric of reality, and you may think that you can twist it, but the truth always exists. And if you lie to try and make your life more convenient, because that's generally what it is, you're trying to make your life easier than if you told the truth, you can start to think that that's actually going to hold. And that's very arrogant and incorrect because every truth eventually ends up coming out. Everything ends up returning back to its natural state, and you're not going to get away with a lie forever. And while you are getting away with a lie, you're going to find yourself becoming distrustful of the world, and you won't like the world because you know it's not real. And you assume that just like you, everybody else is telling a bunch of lies to make it seem the way they think it is because you know that you are twisting it yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. And rule 12, it's a very simple one. Be grateful in spite of your suffering. He subscribes to the idea that suffering is an integral part of life, something you can't get away from, but that you need to be taking time to be grateful for every positive thing in your life, even though that suffering is unavoidable.
Yeah.
And I think that's, certainly gratitude is important. Certainly, I think that's an important thing to be reminding yourself of. Always be grateful for everything that you have because you may not have it forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
His antidote to suffering is like, you're definitely going to suffer, so suffer in a way that's meaningful.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Feel like your life means something. And following his rules can end up making you feel like you have a life that has meaning and therefore a life worth suffering for.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, you got to spend money, so spend it on something good kind of thing. Like, you got to suffer, so suffer for a really, really good reason.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's about it. Did you have any other questions or comments?
No.
Cool. Well, night school.
Night school.